My name is Earl, and I've lived in Sleepy Hollow for over 50 years. Before I begin, let me tell you this. Our town was always quiet, peaceful even. But things started changing. Sleepy Hollow is a small town, barely 1,000 people, and everyone knows everyone. When something strange happens here, you hear about it fast. The first time something truly sinister happened was in the winter of 1974. I remember that day like it was yesterday. It was a cold, overcast afternoon, typical of winter in these parts. The snow had already covered the streets and the first gusts of freezing wind began to blow. A young man from town, Danny Cook, 19 years old, went for his usual walk in the woods, something he did every weekend. But he never came back. His family started searching for him shortly after, but the only clue they found was a boot discarded next to a tree by the riverbank. No sign of Danny, no footprints, nothing. The local police investigated, but there were no leads. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. At first it seemed like a simple case, a young man out for a walk who got lost or maybe hurt. But as time passed, people began to whisper. They spoke of something darker, something sinister. And just like that, the disappearance became something more, something the town couldn't shake off. It wasn't long before strange things started happening. Folks in town claimed they saw shadows moving in the woods, even though no one should have been out there. Some swore they heard footsteps behind them, though no one was ever there when they turned around. The air in town grew heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, but nobody dared to speak it aloud. We were all terrified. I tried to brush it off. I mean, nothing had really changed, right? Just a missing person, a young man who got lost. But then, as I walked to the general store one evening, I felt it, something watching me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone, but no one was there. It was just me and the empty, snow-covered street. The disappearance of Danny Cook haunted the town, and even though weeks passed, it still felt like we were all holding our breath. People started to avoid the woods, afraid that something was out there, something that took Danny and wouldn't stop until it had more. It wasn't just the people of Sleepy Hollow who felt it. The forest seemed different somehow. Darker, the trees looked like they were closing in, hiding something just beyond the branches. Everyone seemed to agree that there was something off about the whole situation, though no one dared to voice it. The police, well, they didn't know what to do. They had no answers. They asked around, followed leads, but nothing made sense. In the end, Danny was declared a missing person, and the case was closed, but the feeling in Sleepy Hollow never quite went away. It's hard to explain, but there's a presence in this town now, something that wasn't here before, something that followed that winter day when a young man left for a walk and never returned. The woods don't seem as safe as they used to, and Sleepy Hollow isn't as peaceful anymore. And the worst part? We all know it's only a matter of time before someone else disappears. The darkness that started with Danny has been growing ever since, and it's only a matter of time before we all feel its grip. Months passed after Danny Cook's disappearance, but the tension in Sleepy Hollow never quite faded. People were still on edge, afraid to venture too far into the woods, and rumors about what might be lurking out there only seemed to grow stronger. It wasn't until May of 1975 that things escalated once again, and this time I was terrified in a way I couldn't ignore. Sarah Miller, a college student from the next town over, had come to visit her grandmother. She was a bright, energetic young woman who had heard the stories about Danny and was determined not to let fear control her. One evening, she announced she was going for a walk in the woods. She said she would follow the same trail Danny had, taken months before just to clear her head. I remember that night like it was yesterday. The air was thick with the humidity of late spring, and there was a sense of unease in the town. Some of us had been hoping that Sarah, being an outsider, might shed some light on what happened to Danny. But as hours passed and she didn't return, worry began to settle in. Her grandmother was frantic, and soon everyone was searching the woods for her. People called out her name, their voices echoing through the trees, but the only answer was the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was getting late, and the tension was palpable. I joined the search as the evening drew on. We combed through the forest, shouting her name, but the only signs we found were faint footprints in the dirt, leading deeper into the woods. It didn't make sense. If Sarah had walked this far, why didn't she turn back? The strange part came when we found a piece of her jacket caught on a thorn bush just off the trail. We looked around, but there was nothing. No sign of Sarah. We searched all night, but by morning she was still gone. The town was in an uproar. The police were called in, but like with Danny, there were no real leads. We retraced her steps, hoping to find something that might explain what happened, but nothing added up. There were no signs of a struggle, no screams, no indication of what had happened to her. The woods remained eerily silent, like they were hiding something. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The first disappearance, while shocking, had been easier to brush off as an accident or bad luck. But now, with Sarah gone, the fear was spreading. The people of Sleepy Hollow weren't just afraid of the woods, they were afraid of what was happening to their town, and it wasn't just the disappearances. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right. I remember walking home one night after another failed search for Sarah, and as I passed the edge of the woods, I felt a presence. It wasn't like before. It wasn't just fear. It was something else. A coldness. Like the woods themselves were alive, watching, waiting for something, or someone, to return. The following days were filled with whispers and rumors. Some people said they'd seen strange figures near the forest at night. Others spoke of hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there. I heard the stories, but I couldn't bring myself to believe them. Not yet. But there was one thing that stuck with me. I went to visit Billings, the old man who ran the hardware store, to try and make sense of it all. Billings was known for his stories, and he had lived here longer than anyone. One evening, I asked him about the history of the woods, hoping he might shed some light on the situation. Billings just looked at me for a long time before speaking, his voice low. "They've always been there, Earl," he said, pointing to the forest behind the store. "The woods have always taken what they wanted. Danny was the first, but not the last. People have been vanishing for as long as this town's been around." He went on to tell me about the old tales, the ones that most of us had dismissed as superstition. He spoke of a man, a figure who walked the woods and took people, the man of the forest, he called him, a dark figure that no one ever saw up close, but whose presence was felt by anyone who dared to venture too far into the trees. According to Billings, this figure didn't just take people for fun. He took them because they were marked, chosen in some way by the forest itself. I didn't know whether to believe him. But when I left his shop that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the town was being watched, as though we were all being marked, one by one, and that the woods were waiting for its next victim. And that's when it hit me. Sarah. Miller wasn't the first to vanish, and she wouldn't be the last. Something dark had settled over Sleepy Hollow, and it wasn't going to let go. The woods weren't just a place for hiking anymore. They had become something far worse. They had become a place of fear, and whoever or whatever lived in them was waiting for more to disappear. The year after Sarah Miller's disappearance, things in Sleepy Hollow only grew more unsettling. The town had already been on edge, and now, after 2 inexplicable disappearances, the fear seemed to cling to the very air we breathed. It wasn't just the empty streets or the whispers that filled the corners of the town. There was something else. Something in the woods. Something we couldn't explain, but could feel. It was late autumn of 1976 when the rumors began about a strange figure that had been seen near the edge of the woods. I first heard about it when I was chatting with my neighbor, Old Man Jenkins, outside the local diner. He spoke in a low voice, as if he didn't want anyone to overhear. "Somebody's been hanging around the trees," he said, glancing over his shoulder, as if the figure might be nearby. "Some tall, thin man, wearing all black. Ain't no one seen him close, but folks say he's always there, watching from the shadows." At first, I dismissed it. A person lost in the woods. A hunter, maybe, or someone just passing through. But the more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. It wasn't like Sleepy Hollow had an influx of visitors, especially not after what had happened to Danny and Sarah. And anyway, the figure Jenkins described didn't fit with anyone I knew. That same evening, I had to go into town to pick up a few things from the hardware store. As I was walking back down Main Street, I felt it, the familiar sensation of being watched, a prickling on the back of my neck, like something was just out of sight, waiting for me to turn around. I glanced down the street, but there was nothing there, just the flickering streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement. But then, just beyond the edge of the street, by the trees, I saw it. A shadow. A figure standing motionless, its outline barely visible under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was tall, unnaturally so. The figure was draped in a long, dark coat that seemed to blend with the night, and a wide-brimmed hat obscured its face. But there was no mistaking it. Someone was out there, watching. I froze. My heart started pounding in my chest. It wasn't just the height of the figure that unsettled me. It was the stillness. This person didn't move a muscle, didn't even shift. It was like they were waiting for something. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether to approach or turn back. But before I could make a decision, the figure seemed to vanish into the woods. One moment it was there, and the next it was gone, like a shadow that never existed in the first place. I rushed back to my house, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what I had just seen, but I knew it was connected to everything that had been happening in Sleepy Hollow. There was no doubt in my mind. The next day, I went over to the diner, hoping to talk with Jenkins about the figure, but when I asked him, he just gave me a strange look, like he hadn't expected me to bring it up. "You saw him, didn't you?" he said, his voice low. "I told you he was real. He's been here longer than we think. I don't know what he wants, but I know he's been here for years, always watching, waiting." The more I listened to Jenkins, the more unnerved I became. He went on to say that the figure was often seen near the woods during the late hours of the night, always lingering just out of sight, but no one ever approached him, and anyone who had tried to speak with him had disappeared. "What do you mean, disappeared?" I asked, my throat tight. Jenkins shook his head. "I'm telling you, Earl, this man, or whatever he is, isn't someone you want to mess with. People who've gone after him or tried to talk to him, They don't come back. It's like the woods take them. It's always been that way. The fear in Jenkins's voice was genuine. He wasn't just repeating stories, he believed it. I didn't know what to make of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was happening in Sleepy Hollow, and that figure, the one no one ever truly saw, was at the center of it all. I decided to go into the woods the following night, hoping to find some answers. It was risky, I knew that, but I couldn't let this mystery go unsolved. I'd seen enough to know that something dark was going on in this town, and I wasn't going to let it continue without understanding it. I gathered a flashlight and a rope, just in case. But when I entered the woods, I felt a strange pull, like the trees themselves were urging me deeper into the shadows. The deeper I walked, the more oppressive the air became. It wasn't just cold, it was suffocating. The forest seemed to close in around me, and every step felt heavier than the last. And then I saw it again. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but no. There he was, the figure, standing in the same spot I'd seen him the night before. This time, there was no mistaking it. He was real. He was here. But before I could react, the figure began to move. Not toward me, but away from me, disappearing into the depths of the woods. I tried to follow, but no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't catch up. It was like he was leading me somewhere. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, but they weren't my own. They were behind me, echoing in the silence of the forest. I turned around, heart racing, but there was nothing. No one. Only the thick, choking darkness that had swallowed everything. I didn't stay another second. I turned and ran back toward the town, not looking back once, even when I felt like something was right on my heels. I didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. I couldn't. But I knew one thing for sure. The figure I had seen wasn't just a man. And whatever he was tied to the darkness in Sleepy Hollow. He was part of the very thing that had been taking people from this town. The stranger in the woods wasn't just a rumor. He was real. And he was watching. Always. By the time winter of 1977 arrived, the town of Sleepy Hollow was no longer the same. It had become a place weighed down by an unshakable tension, where people avoided certain places and stared nervously into the trees, half expecting to see someone or something staring back. The disappearance of Sarah, Danny, and now the strange sightings of the figure in the woods had made everyone wary. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened next. It was just before Christmas, the streets of Sleepy Hollow blanketed with fresh snow, when I began to notice strange occurrences happening once again. The first was a scream. I heard it late one evening, coming from the woods just past the old mill. It was short, sharp, a sound that sent a chill running down my spine. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just an animal or some trick of the wind, but deep down, I knew better. The next day, my worst fears were realized. I was walking along the road to the local store when I saw something odd. A figure, not far from the woods, was standing by the same spot I had seen the tall man months ago. My heart dropped into my stomach. For a moment, I wondered if it was him again, the man who'd been watching us. But when I looked closer, I saw something more disturbing. The figure was holding something. Someone. It was a body. The lifeless form of a woman lay in the man's arms, her face hidden beneath a veil of snow-white hair. The figure didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence as I stood frozen in place, watching. Then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned his head slowly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his eyes. Dark, empty, cold. I couldn't breathe. For a moment, time stood still. The figure didn't speak, didn't make any sound, but I could feel the weight of his gaze pressing into me, forcing me to stay rooted to the spot. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he turned and disappeared into the trees, the body vanishing with him. I couldn't process what I had seen. My mind raced, but my feet refused to move. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to tear myself away from the spot. The world felt wrong. Everything felt wrong. I didn't tell anyone immediately. How could I? Who would believe me? But I couldn't let it go. I had to find out who that body was, what had happened. And if I was right, if that figure had taken someone else, then I had to stop it. That night, I went back to the woods, prepared to confront whatever nightmare was hiding there. I couldn't just sit back and let more people disappear. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the wind seemed to grow colder, the shadows more suffocating. The trees loomed over me, their branches creaking and groaning under the weight of the snow. Every step I took felt like it was pulling me further into something I didn't understand. And then I saw it again. The figure. He was standing near the same tree where I had seen him before, though this time there was no body in his arms. He was waiting, watching me, as though he had known I would come. I froze. The air seemed to thin, the darkness pressing in on me. My mind screamed at me to turn around and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, caught in the gaze of something ancient, something far beyond my understanding. "You're not supposed to be here." The figure's voice broke the silence, low and chilling. It wasn't a whisper, but it wasn't a shout either. It was as though the words came from everywhere at once, filling my head with an icy dread. "Sleepy Hollow isn't for the living anymore." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I tried to speak, to ask what he meant, but no sound came from my mouth. The figure's eyes glinted in the moonlight, and I could feel the weight of something heavy, something malevolent hanging in the air between us. "You've seen too much," he continued, his voice colder now, more final. "You can't stop what's been set in motion." My heart was racing, and for the first time in years I felt truly helpless. I didn't know what to do, where to go. The figure was right. This town, this cursed place, had already claimed so many. What made me think I could be the one to stop it? But then, before I could process another thought, the figure turned and walked away, his tall form melting into the darkness. I stood there for a moment longer, the silence of the woods pressing in on me like a suffocating blanket, and that's when I heard it. A voice, soft and familiar. "Earl, help me." It was Sarah's voice. I spun around, my heart in my throat. It was her. But no, it couldn't be. Sarah had been gone for over a year. The voice came again, this time closer. "Earl, please, help me." I followed the voice, unable to stop myself, my feet moving on their own, drawn by the desperation in her words. As I pushed through the trees, I saw her, standing in the clearing, bathed in moonlight, her face pale and twisted in pain. But it wasn't Sarah, not truly. Her eyes were wide with terror, but there was something in them, something empty, something hollow. "No?" I whispered, stepping back. The figure appeared once more, standing in the shadows just beyond the clearing. "I warned you," he said softly. "There are things you can't save." I couldn't run. I couldn't even breathe. And then, without another word, the figure stepped forward and vanished into the night, leaving me with nothing but the echo of Sarah's voice and the realization that Sleepy Hollow wasn't just haunted by the past, it was alive, feeding on the fear and desperation of those who stayed. The woods had claimed another, and no one in this town was safe. Not from the darkness, not from the figure in the forest. And as I turned and stumbled out of the woods, the last thing I heard was that voice again, whispering my name into the night. "Help me." But by then, I knew it was already too late.